Real stories of werewolves, of Dogman history, from your emails, illustrated and animated with the democratizing magic of machine learning AI. Welcome to Scary Stories.
The Mancelona Monster. Dear Scary Stories NYC. This is a story of my Michigan Dogman sighting. It's also the most moving thing that ever happened to me. I know that might sound strange. How can a cryptid encounter be deeply emotional? But this particular sighting changed everything I thought I knew about unexplained phenomena and gave me something I desperately needed during one of the darkest periods of my life. It happened on a winter day just a little while after my mother had peacefully left this world. I was driving north on Darrow Road, just south of Mancelona, Michigan, when I witnessed something that connected me to her in the most unexpected way. But to understand why this encounter meant so much to me, I need to take you back to over a decade earlier. My mother started reporting unusual sightings behind her home more than 10 years before her passing. She would describe seeing what she called a dog-headed Sasquatch in the woods behind her property. At first I was absolutely thrilled by these reports. As someone fascinated by cryptids, particularly the Michigan Dogman legend, I thought we might have stumbled onto something incredible. Mom's descriptions were remarkably consistent. She'd talk about a tall bipedal creature with a distinctly canine head, covered in dark fur, that would occasionally emerge from the tree line near dusk. She wasn't frightened by it, more curious than anything. It just watches, she'd say, like it's trying to figure us out as much as we're trying to figure it out. At the time, I encouraged her to keep documenting these sightings. We'd talk for hours about the creature's behavior, its apparent intelligence, and how it seemed to maintain a respectful distance from the house. For a brief time, I felt like we were part of something extraordinary together. But then things began to change. Gradually, Mom's mind started taking different paths. The sharp woman who had raised me, who could remember every detail of a story from 30 years ago, began struggling with recent memories. Simple tasks became challenging. The cognitive changes were subtle at first and then more pronounced. As her condition progressed, I made the heartbreaking assumption that the Dogman sightings had been early symptoms of her illness. It seemed logical at the time. Weren't hallucinations part of this terrible journey that she was on? I convinced myself that the creature she described so vividly had never actually existed outside her changing mind. When Mom peacefully passed that autumn, I carried that assumption with me into grief. The Dogman stories became just another thing that I'd lost. Not just my mother, but the brief excitement we'd shared about her mysterious visitor. That winter morning started like any other difficult day during those first few months without her. The snow had been falling steadily, blanketing northern Michigan in that particular kind of silence that only comes with a proper snowstorm. I was driving north on Darrow Road, heading toward Mancelona, when the weather began to worsen. The road was nearly deserted. Smart people were staying home. But I pressed on through the virgin snow, my windshield wipers working overtime against the heavy flakes. The world outside looked pristine, untouched, like a blank canvas waiting for something significant to be written across it. As I approached the Mancelona House of Prayer, something caught my eye. Movement. Behind the church, near the tree line, a dark shape was emerging from the woods. At first I thought it might be a person, maybe someone seeking shelter from the storm. But as the figure moved closer to the road, walking with a very distinctive gait, my heart began to race. This wasn't a human. There was no other traffic on the snowy road. I pulled the car over, my engine idling quietly. Through my windshield, I watched as the exact creature my mother had described to me so many times walked purposefully toward the street. It was tall, 7 or 8 feet, with broad shoulders and a distinctly canine head. Dark fur covered its entire body, and it moved with a confident stride that spoke of intelligence and awareness. This wasn't some mindless beast stumbling through the woods. This was exactly what Mom had seen behind her house all those years ago. The creature approached within maybe 50 yards of my car, close enough that I could make out individual features. Its ears, were pointed and alert, constantly moving as it assessed its surroundings. The snout was elongated, but not quite like a wolf, something between dog and wolf, with almost human-like intelligence in its bearing. For what felt like an hour, we observed each other. The dogman seemed as curious about me as I was about it. There was no aggression, no threat, just mutual recognition of an unusual encounter. Then, as if deciding it had seen enough, the creature calmly turned and walked back toward the woods behind the house of prayer, disappearing into the tree line as suddenly as it had appeared. I sat in my car for several minutes after the creature vanished, my hands shaking, not from fear, but from the overwhelming emotional impact of what had just happened. This wasn't just a cryptid sighting. This was vindication of my mother's experiences, proof that her mind had been clear and accurate during those earlier years. The tears came without warning. All this time I had dismissed her sightings as symptoms of her illness, but she had been telling the truth. Her descriptions had been perfect, down to the smallest details. The way it moved, the intelligent curiosity in its behavior, even its apparent comfort around human spaces. Everything matched exactly. But there was something more profound happening in that moment. Sitting there in the pristine snow, in the sight of the house of prayer, I felt an overwhelming sense of my mother's presence. It was as if she had somehow arranged this encounter, given me this gift of understanding and validation. The location felt significant, too. The virgin snow representing purity, a clean slate, a fresh beginning, and having the sighting near the house of prayer added a spiritual dimension that I just couldn't ignore. It felt like a sacred moment, witnessed by something greater than myself. As I finally put my car back in drive and continued down Darrow Road, I couldn't shake the feeling that Mom was somewhere, somehow, smiling about what had just happened. She'd always been protective of me, always wanting to shield me from hurt or disappointment. Even in her final years, when her mind was traveling paths I couldn't follow, there were moments of clarity where her love for me shone through unchanged. This felt like one final act of motherly care, showing me that the experiences we had shared, the excitement we had felt together about her mysterious visitor, had been real and valid. She was telling me in the most direct way possible that I shouldn't doubt what we had discovered together. The grief I had been carrying began to transform into something else. Instead of feeling like I had lost everything about our shared experience, I now felt more connected to her than I had since her passing. We were still sharing something extraordinary, even across whatever boundary separates this world from the next. Don't go anywhere. We've got a whole hour of Dogman stories coming up right after this.
Team Dogman for men of the world. And it also looks cute on girls. The hat says Dogman, I'm happy to meet you. But there's no guarantee that Dogman won't eat you. Team Dogman hat, it's the prescription. The link to get your own is in the description.
The Werewolf of Suburban Pennsylvania. Dear Scary Stories NYC. The Dogman I saw in my youth was a creature that belonged in the flickering black and white world of Saturday night chiller theater, not padding silently between the Buicks and Chevelles parked along a tree-lined suburban street on that humid Pennsylvania evening in 1978. But there it was, moving with an unsettling ease past pink flamingos and above-ground pools, a living nightmare given form in suburbia. The werewolf, which is what we called it back then, since we didn't have names like Dogman or Cryptid in our vocabulary, stood nearly 7 feet tall when it rose to its full height. Its massive frame cast shadows that seemed to swallow the weak glow of the street lamps. The creature's fur was dark, and when it turned its head to sniff the air, amber yellow eyes caught the light like reflectors on a midnight highway. What struck me most, even through my terror, was how wrong it looked in that setting. This was suburbia, ranch houses with attached garages, chain-link fences protecting postage stamp lawns, and the distant hum of air conditioners working overtime against the August heat. This was where families grilled hamburgers and kids played kickball until their mothers called them in for dinner. This wasn't a place where monsters prowled between garbage cans set out for Monday morning pickup. But there it was, and I was watching from Danny's bedroom window on the second floor of his family's impossible house, the one that looked like dark shadows had collided with a blue-collar paycheck. Danny was beside me, practically vibrating with vindicated excitement, whispering, "See? See? I told you, man. I told you it was real." This all happened 45 years ago, and I still wake up some nights with the memory of those yellow eyes scanning the neighborhood like they were searching for something specific. The thing about being 14 or 15 in 1978 was that the world still held mysteries. We didn't have the internet to explain away every shadow and sound. When something defied explanation, it simply remained unexplained. And then it would settle into the dark corners of your mind where it would fester and grow. And this creature, this impossible thing, was the kind of mystery that changes you forever. I've spent decades trying to rationalize what I saw that night, but memory has its own truth separate from logic or reason. And my memory insists that on a muggy Saturday in August, while families across Pennsylvania settled in to watch monster movies on their TV sets, a real monster walked among them, as out of place as a Gothic cathedral in a shopping mall parking lot. That was the night everything changed. The night Danny's wild stories stopped being stories and became something else entirely. The night that I learned that sometimes the most unbelievable truths hide in plain sight, padding silently past suburban driveways on feet that should have belonged to nightmares, not to the world where I rode my Schwinn to Little League practice, and I bought comic books at the 5 and 10 store. Danny burst into my 7th grade world like a character escaped from one of his favorite horror movies, all manic energy and intense stares, speaking in breathless torrents about things that made other kids back away slowly. While most kids we knew were obsessing over Star Wars and whether the Steelers would make it to another Super Bowl, Danny lived in a universe populated by vampires, werewolves, and creatures that stalked the Pennsylvania woods when decent people were asleep in their beds. I first noticed him during lunchtime, sitting alone at a table by the cafeteria windows, surrounded by a fortress of library books with titles like Lycanthropy, Myth or Reality, and The Supernatural in Colonial Pennsylvania. He was big, sweaty, and fat, with dark curly hair that always looked dirty, and he wore the same black t-shirt 3 days out of every week, a faded image of Christopher Lee as Dracula that had seen better days. What caught my attention wasn't his odd choice in reading material, but the way he talked to himself while he read, not mumbling or whispering, but having actual conversations, complete with different voices and animated gestures. He'd lean back in his chair and say something like, "Now see, that's exactly what I'm talking about." Then he'd lean forward conspiratorially and respond in a different tone, "But you have to consider the lunar cycles, Daniel. It's all about the lunar cycles." Most kids thought Danny was disturbed. Maybe they were right. But there was something about his absolute conviction that drew me in like metal shavings to a magnet. When Danny told you he'd seen a werewolf near the park, not once, but several times, he didn't tell it like he was trying to get attention or scare you. He told it like he was filing a field report, matter of fact and detailed, with the kind of specificity that made you want to believe him, despite every rational instinct screaming otherwise. Last Tuesday around 9:30, he'd say, leaning across the lunch table with those intense, dark, ringed eyes. He was checking the garbage cans behind the supermarket, not scavenging, checking them, like he was looking for something specific. And it caught my scent. It stood up on its hind legs and stared right at me, through the chain-link fence. Had to be 7 feet tall, easy, maybe 8. And then he described the creature's hands, because they weren't paws, he insisted. They were hands with elongated fingers and opposable thumbs, covered in coarse fur, but undeniably human in their articulation. He described how the creature moved, sometimes on all fours like a wolf, but usually upright like a man who had forgotten how to be human. The details were always consistent, always specific, and delivered with the kind of passionate certainty that made you forget for a moment that such things were impossible. Well, maybe I should have walked away. I guess a sensible kid would have. But at that age I was a collector of monster magazines and comic books, and Danny always seemed to have issues with him that I'd never seen before. He'd walk me home after school, taking the long way through neighborhoods I'd never explored, pointing out houses where he felt something felt wrong, or empty lots where he said the grass just doesn't grow right. His world was full of signs and portents that most people simply didn't notice. A dead bird found in a perfect circle of withered dandelions. Scratch marks on a telephone pole that were too high and too deep to have been made by any ordinary animal. The way certain dogs would whimper and hide when we passed specific street corners. The first time Danny invited me to his house, I thought I'd gotten the address wrong. This couldn't be right. Not in this neighborhood of modest one-story homes, where the biggest architectural statement was usually a bay window or an attached garage. But there it was, on the corner of a block of perfectly normal houses. It was, I think, 3 stories above the ground, with weeping willow trees packed in tight all around it. Clearly the oldest home in the area. It looked as if the Addams family had relocated to working-class Pennsylvania. There was dark shadows on a shoestring budget. A mansion built for someone with champagne tastes, but a beer wallet. Walking up the cracked slate path felt like entering a different world. The air was cooler under the willows, and sounds from the street became muffled and distant. Even the smell was different, earthy and rich, with an underlying dampness that reminded me of old cellars and forgotten corners. Danny's parents answered the door together, which struck me as odd. "This is my friend Jimmy," Danny announced, and I could hear the pride in his voice. "I told you about him. He's the one who wants to know more about the creature." The inside of the house was even more disorienting than the outside. The front hallway stretched back further than should have been possible, given the lot size, and disappeared into shadows that electric lights couldn't quite penetrate. Danny led me through a maze of rooms that seemed to exist in defiance of architectural logic. Every room felt lived in and abandoned at the same time, as if the family had slowly been retreating to smaller and smaller spaces within their own house. But it was the sounds that really unsettled me. As we climbed the main staircase toward Danny's room, I became aware of noises coming from somewhere above us. Scratching sounds like fingernails on wood, and a soft whimpering that was human? Or maybe not. When I paused to listen more carefully, Danny grabbed my arm and pulled me along. "That's just my sister," he said quickly, not meeting my eyes. "What's wrong with your sister?" I asked, but Danny was already pushing open the door to his bedroom and already changing the subject. His room was a shrine to Christopher Lee as Dracula. Every available surface was covered with movie posters, publicity stills, and magazine clippings. Lee's aristocratic face stared down from the walls in dozens of different poses, baring his fangs, spreading his cape, fixing the camera with those bloodshot eyes. There were images from all the Hammer horror films starring Dracula, The Horror of Dracula, Dracula Prince of Darkness, Dracula Has Risen from the Grave, Taste the Blood of Dracula. I was inside the bedroom of Dracula's most devoted fan. But the centerpiece of the room was the bed, or rather what Danny used for a bed. It appeared to me to be a coffin, an actual wooden coffin, lined with red velvet and fitted with a thin mattress and pillow. The lid was propped open against the wall, revealing the satin interior where Danny apparently slept every night. I must have stared for a full minute before I found my voice. "Danny, is that real?" He nodded proudly. "My uncle works for a funeral home. He got it for me when they ordered the wrong size for somebody. Pretty cool, right?" Cool wasn't the word I might have chosen. Terrifying, maybe. Or disturbed. But Danny was watching me with such eager anticipation that I managed to nod and say, "Yeah, that's really something, Dan." As we settled in to look through his collection of monster magazines, the scratching sounds from upstairs continued. Sometimes they would stop for a few minutes, only to resume with renewed intensity. Once I could have sworn I heard what sounded like crying. Not the ordinary tears of a sick child, but something raw and desperate that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Shouldn't someone check on your sister?" I asked, during one particularly loud episode. Danny's parents had been moving around downstairs, their footsteps creaking across the old floorboards, but when the crying started everything went silent. Even the normal household sounds, the hum of appliances, tick of clocks, seemed to pause. "She doesn't like strangers," Danny said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It upsets her when there are people in the house that she doesn't know." But that didn't explain why I never saw her, or was never allowed to see her, not even a glimpse through a doorway. And all the times I visited Danny's house over the next few months, his sister was always completely hidden, like something out of those gothic novels where mysterious relatives are locked away in attics or towers or forbidden wings. The scratching and whimpering became as much a part of the house's atmosphere as the creaking floorboards and the smell of old wood, constant background elements that everyone pretended not to notice. The whole family seemed to exist in a state of careful tension, as if they were all performers in a play where forgetting your lines might have serious consequences. Conversations stopped abruptly when I entered rooms. Doors that had been open would be closed by the time I walked down the same hallway again. And through it all, the sounds from upstairs continued like a soundtrack to our visits. Scratch, whimper, silence, repeat. The evening Danny finally vindicated every wild claim he'd ever made started like any other Saturday at his house. We'd spent the afternoon in his coffin bedroom, poring over his latest acquisition, a dog-eared copy of Famous Monsters of Filmland that he found at a used bookstore downtown. The scratching sounds from upstairs had been particularly active that day, and I noticed his parents speaking in hushed tones whenever they thought I wasn't listening. As darkness began to settle over the neighborhood, Danny suddenly straightened up from the magazine he'd been reading. "It's time," he said, glancing toward his bedroom window. "The creature usually appears right around now on Saturdays." I had heard this claim already dozens of times, but something in Danny's voice was different that night. Less manic enthusiasm and more quiet certainty. He moved to the window with the deliberate precision of someone performing a familiar ritual. The view from his second-story room offered a perfect line of sight across the rooftops and backyards to the park, about a half-mile away, where ancient oak trees formed dark silhouettes against the evening sky. "There," Danny whispered, pointing toward a gap between two houses where the park's edge was visible. "That's where it comes out to hunt." At first I thought it was just shadows shifting as the last daylight faded, but then the movement became more purposeful and more solid. A shape emerged from the darkness between the oak trees, something large and wrong that didn't belong in any suburban tableau. The creature stood upright like a man, but even from that distance, everything about its proportions screamed inhuman. Too tall, too broad through the shoulders, with limbs that seemed to bend in ways that defied human anatomy. When it moved, it flowed rather than walked, covering ground with an efficiency that made my stomach clench with primal unease. "Wow," I breathed, pressing my face closer to the glass. "What is that thing?" Danny didn't answer immediately. He was watching with the focused intensity of a scientist, observing a long-awaited experiment finally proving successful. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of his usual excited chatter. "That's what I've been trying to tell you," he said quietly. "That's the thing that lives in our woods." We watched in stunned silence as the creature moved along the park's perimeter with obvious purpose. Sometimes it dropped to all fours, moving like a wolf, but then it would rear up again onto its hind legs, standing tall enough to peer over the chain-link fence that bordered the residential area. Even from our distant vantage point, I could see that its front limbs ended not in paws, but in something disturbingly hand-like. The most unsettling aspect was how deliberately it moved. This wasn't some mindless beast wandering randomly through the night. The creature was hunting, or searching, maybe patrolling, following some internal logic that felt ancient and alien. When it paused to examine something on the ground, tilting its massive head with almost human curiosity, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. For maybe 10 minutes, we watched this impossible thing move through our ordinary world, and then as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature melted back into the shadows between the trees, and it was gone. Neither of us spoke for a long time after that. What was there to say? Every rational explanation I carried in my 14-year-old mind had just evaporated like morning mist. Danny had not been making up stories, or seeking attention, or suffering from an overactive imagination fueled by too many monster movies either. He'd been telling the literal truth, and I just witnessed proof that the world contained mysteries far stranger and more terrifying than anything Hollywood had ever dreamed up. "We have to get closer," Danny finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We have to see it up close." Now the smart thing would have probably been to forget what I'd seen, to convince myself it had been a trick of shadows, or maybe some prank. But at the age of 14 or 15, with my worldview suddenly cracked wide open, the smart thing felt like cowardice. Danny was offering me a chance to step across that threshold between the mundane and the miraculous, and despite every survival instinct screaming warnings, I knew I was going to take it. "Next weekend," I heard myself saying. "We'll go to the park. Next weekend." Danny turned from the window, and in the dim light his smile looked almost as unsettling as the creature we just witnessed. "I knew you'd understand," he said. "I knew you would want to know the truth." The next Saturday evening arrived gray and humid, with heavy clouds promising rain later in the night. We met at the park entrance just as the streetlights were beginning to flicker on, both of us trying to project confidence while battling our own inner terror. The playground equipment that had seemed so familiar during daylight hours now loomed like alien structures in the gathering darkness. About halfway to the wooded area where we'd seen the creature emerge, Danny suddenly stopped walking. In the pale glow of the distant streetlights, I could see that his face had gone completely white. "I can't do this," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I thought I could, but I can't. What if it's hungry? What if it sees us as threats?" For a moment I was more shocked by Danny's fear than I had been by the creature itself. This kid had spent months trying to convince me that supernatural predators roamed our neighborhood. He had collected werewolf sightings like other kids collected baseball cards. Seeing him suddenly paralyzed by the reality of what we were attempting made the danger feel immediate and visceral. "Maybe we should just watch from the edge of the woods," I suggested, trying to keep my own voice steady. "We don't have to get close." But Danny was already backing away, shaking his head frantically. "No, this is stupid. This is dumb. This is how people get killed in horror movies. I don't want to get killed like in a horror movie, so I'm going home." And then he was running, crashing through the underbrush toward the park entrance, leaving me alone in the darkness, with nothing but the sound of footsteps fading into the distance and my own hammering heartbeat. I probably should have followed him. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to run, to get out of those woods and back to the safety of streetlights and houses and normal Saturday night television. But something kept me frozen in place, partly stubborn teenage pride, partly a desperate need to know if what we'd seen from Danny's window had been real. So I stood there, alone in the gathering darkness, waiting for something impossible to happen. I didn't have to wait long. The creature appeared without warning, emerging from shadows between two massive oak trees, like it had simply materialized from the darkness itself. One moment I was staring at empty woods, the next I was face to face with something that should not have existed. Up close it was even more terrifying than it had been from Danny's window. The creature stood nearly 8 feet tall on its hind legs, its body covered in coarse dark fur that seemed to absorb but little light filtered through the tree canopy. But it was the eyes that paralyzed me, amber yellow, intelligent, utterly alien, studying me with the focused attention of a predator evaluating potential prey. For seconds that felt like hours, he simply stared. I was frozen not just by fear, but by the absolute impossibility of what I was experiencing. This thing belonged in nightmares, not in a suburban park where I played Little League Baseball just months earlier. Then, the creature began to circle me, moving on all fours, its massive head never turning away from my face. I could smell it now. A wild musky scent, mixed with something darker. When it completed its circle, it rose again to its full height, and began to sniff me systematically, starting at my feet and working its way up. The creature's breath was hot against my neck, when it leaned in to examine my scent more closely. I could see its front paws more clearly now. They were hands, just as Danny had insisted, with elongated fingers and opposable thumbs, covered in the same coarse fur, but undeniably human in their articulation and movement. When one of those hands reached out to touch my shoulder, I nearly fainted from terror. But the creature didn't attack. Instead, after what felt like an eternity of examination, It stepped back and fixed me with those yellow eyes. Then it growled. And that one noise spoke 1,000 words to me. I didn't need to be told twice. My legs, which had been frozen in fear for the past several minutes, suddenly remembered how to move. I stumbled backward, never taking my eyes off that creature until I reached the path. Then I turned and I ran, crashing through the underbrush just like Danny had, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't stop running until I reached the street. Even then, I kept looking back over my shoulder, expecting to see those yellow eyes following me through the darkness. But the creature had let me go. Whether out of mercy, indifference, or some alien code of conduct, I couldn't begin to understand. It had examined me, found me wanting, or maybe harmless, and it had allowed me to escape. And that was the last time I ever saw anything out of the ordinary in my otherwise quite boring life. The end. She's the coolest in the world, you see. She's none other than Crystal B. Please join me in thanking Crystal B for her big donation of $25 that she made using our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. That money gets through to us immediately, and I can assure you that it has already been spent on groceries. Crystal B is truly a lifesaver, and we can't thank her enough. The Dogman and my cat. Dear Scary Stories NYC, some friendships defy explanation, transcending the boundaries of what we think we know about the natural world. This is the story of just such a friendship between an orange and white cat named Julian and a creature that shouldn't exist, yet walked among the trees behind my home with the quiet dignity of ancient wisdom. The guardian, as I came to think of this dogman, stood nearly 8 feet tall when he rose to his full height on his hind legs. His body was like that of a man, broad-shouldered and powerful, but covered entirely in thick, coarse fur that shifted from deep brown to gray in the changing light. His head was unmistakably canine, a wolf's noble features with intelligent amber eyes that seemed to hold centuries of forest secrets. What made him truly extraordinary, though, were his hands. Large, capable, unmistakably human in their dexterity, complete with opposable thumbs that could work with surprising gentleness. When he moved through the forest, it was in a style that seemed impossible for something so massive, his footsteps barely disturbing the carpet of fallen leaves. This was the late 1990s. I had chosen to live simply in a tiny cabin, tucked away where the suburbs gave way to genuine wilderness. The house was tiny by most standards, just enough space for one person who preferred books to television and solitude to social gatherings. But it suited me perfectly. The dense forest that bordered my property stretched for miles in every direction, a living wall of oak and pine that stood long before any houses dotted this landscape. During the day, it felt welcoming enough, with shafts of sunlight piercing through the canopy to dapple the forest floor. But as evening approached, these same woods took on a different character entirely, deeper, more mysterious, full of dark shadows that seemed to move independent of the wind. The morning I first spotted my new cat friend, I was sitting on my porch with my usual cup of coffee, watching the mist rise from the forest floor as the sun climbed higher. Movement at the edge of the tree line caught my eye, a flash of orange and white that seemed too deliberate to be autumn leaves stirring in the breeze. He emerged slowly, this cat, as if he were making a grand entrance. I wanted to be sure I was paying attention. His coat was a remarkable blend of deep orange and pristine white, with tabby markings that spoke of wild ancestry, despite his clearly domestic build. He was substantial, not fat, but solid and well-muscled, with the kind of presence that commanded respect. Even from a distance I could see the intelligence in his eyes, as he studied me with the same intensity that I was studying him. For several days we engaged in a careful dance of mutual observation. He would appear at the forest's edge each morning, sometimes sitting for an hour or more, watching me go about my routine. I began leaving small offerings, a saucer of milk, a few pieces of leftover chicken, placing them at the edge of my property line and retreating to give him space. The food did always disappear, although I never saw him eating it. Gradually he grew bolder. First he ventured onto the lawn while I was inside, visible through the kitchen window. Then he began appearing while I sat on the porch, maintaining what he seemed to consider a respectful distance. I started talking to him softly, narrating my activities as if he were an old friend who'd simply been away for a while. "Good morning," I'd say as he materialized from the trees. "I'm just having my coffee. There's some breakfast for you by the oak tree if you're interested." His ears would twitch forward at the sound of my voice, and sometimes he'd offer a small chirp in response. Not quite a meow, but a conversational acknowledgement that we were indeed having a dialogue. The breakthrough came on a summer morning when a sudden thunderstorm rolled through. I was inside watching the rain streak down the windows when I heard a plaintive cry from the porch. There he was, soaked and bedraggled, sitting by my back door with the patient dignity of someone who had finally decided to accept an invitation. I opened the door slowly, not wanting to startle him. "Well," I said, "I suppose you'd better come inside." He walked past me into the house as if he'd been living there for years, shook himself once, and immediately began exploring. Within an hour, he had claimed the sunny spot by the south-facing window, tested the comfort of my reading chair, and somehow communicated that the empty ceramic bowl in my kitchen would do nicely for his meals. Naming him felt important, though I sensed he already had a name. When he came inside, Ivan Julian was taking a guitar solo on an old Richard Hell and the Voidoids album. The name seemed to fit his old soul quality, so I called him Julian. Our early days together established a routine that felt both new and timeless. Julian would patrol the house each morning, checking corners and their windowsills with the thoroughness of a security guard. He claimed the armchair by the fireplace as his official headquarters, although he was generous about sharing it when I wanted to read. In the evenings, he would sit by the window that faced the forest, alert and watchful, as if he were expecting someone. The first time I saw the guardian Dogman, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. It was early evening, and I was washing dishes at the kitchen sink when movement in my peripheral vision made me look up. There, standing at the edge of the forest about 50 yards from the house, was a figure that shouldn't exist. My initial reaction was pure disbelief. The rational part of my mind insisted I was seeing shadows, or perhaps a person in an elaborate costume. But as I stood frozen at the sink, watching this impossible creature watch me in return, I knew with absolute certainty that I was looking at something beyond the boundaries of ordinary experience. The Dogman stood perfectly still, his massive form clearly visible in the dying light. His wolf-like head was turned toward the house, toward me, and even from that distance, I could sense the intelligence in his gaze. He made no threatening moves, showed no signs of aggression. He simply stood there, as if introducing himself in the most courteous way possible. I don't know how long we stared at each other. Time seemed suspended in that moment of impossible recognition. Finally he turned and melted back into the forest, with a silence that seemed to mock his enormous size. My hands were shaking as I set down the dish I'd been holding. Every rational thought I'd ever had about what was possible in the world had just been quietly overturned. Yet strangely, I felt no fear, only a profound sense of wonder, tinged with the understanding that my life had just taken a turn into territory that I never could have imagined. Julian, I noticed, had been sitting by the window the entire time, watching the encounter with the calm attention of someone observing a perfectly normal social interaction. When I looked at him, he offered a small trill of what sounded unmistakably like approval. Over the following days, I found myself alternating between questioning my sanity and eagerly watching for another glimpse of the guardian Dogman. He appeared irregularly, sometimes in the early morning, sometimes at dusk, always maintaining that respectful distance. He never approached the house directly, but his presence was unmistakable. There was something deeply reassuring about his watchful stillness, as if he were standing guard over Julian, and by extension, over me. The guardian's appearance was even more remarkable upon repeated viewings. His thick fur caught the light in shades of gray and russet. His hands, when I caught glimpses of them, were clearly capable of delicate work, despite their size. Most striking of all were his eyes, amber-colored and unmistakably intelligent, holding what I could only describe as ancient wisdom. What truly convinced me that I wasn't losing my mind was Julian's complete comfort with this situation. The cat showed no fear, no territorial aggression, no signs of distress. Instead, he seemed to be waiting for something, his attention constantly drawn to the forest where his mysterious companion kept watch. It was as though they shared some understanding that I was only beginning to glimpse, a connection that transcended the normal boundaries between species, or between the possible and the impossible. The first time I witnessed the bond between Julian and the guardian dogman, I thought I was dreaming. It was a warm evening in late spring, and I had dozed off in my reading chair by the window. I woke to find Julian sitting perfectly still at the glass, his attention focused on something in the forest, with an intensity that made me follow his gaze. There, in a small clearing about 30 yards from the house, sat the guardian dogman. His massive form was folded into a surprisingly graceful sitting position, and Julian was walking toward him, with the confident stride of someone approaching an old friend. I held my breath, certain I was about to witness something terrible. But instead, I watched in wonder as Julian approached the towering creature without hesitation. The guardian dogman remained perfectly still as the cat reached him, and then slowly, carefully, extended one enormous hand. Julian rubbed against those impossible fingers with the same affection he showed me, purring loud enough that I could hear it through the window. What happened next defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world, and my cat. The guardian dogman began to groom Julian with a gentleness that seemed almost impossible for hands so large. His opposable thumbs worked with delicate precision, smoothing Julian's fur and cleaning behind his ears, with the patient care of a devoted companion. Julian leaned into the attention, his purr growing even louder, his eyes half closed in contentment. When the guardian finished, Julian reciprocated. He began grooming the thick fur on the creature's arm, his small pink tongue working methodically, while the guardian dogman sat in perfect patience. It was a scene of such tender mutual care that I felt like an intruder witnessing something private. This became their evening ritual. As twilight settled over the forest, Julian would make his way to the clearing, and the guardian would emerge from deeper in the woods to meet him. They would groom each other with the comfortable familiarity of old friends, sometimes for an hour or more, while I watched from my window, often in amazement. The guardian dogman's presence transformed my understanding of safety. Before Julian brought his friend home, I had felt secure enough in my isolated cabin, but there had always been the normal awareness of being alone in that wilderness. Now, I felt truly protected. The guardian dogman maintained his respectful distance from me, but his watchfulness was constant and reassuring. I could sense him moving through the forest all night, a benevolent sentinel ensuring that no harm would come to Julian, or to me. Our little household found new rhythms. Julian would spend his days with me, napping in sunny spots and supervising my daily activities with his usual dignified attention. But as evening approached, he would position himself by the window, waiting for his friend to appear. And the guardian never kept him waiting for long. Years passed in this unconventional arrangement, and I came to think of the guardian dogman as being as much a part of my life as Julian himself. The seasons changed around us, and we all adapted to the natural cycles of the forest. In winter, the guardian dogman's thick gray fur seemed even more lustrous, and he would sometimes shake snow from his shoulders like a massive dog. In the summer, he would sit in the deeper shade, his amber eyes watchful and patient. Julian aged gracefully through these years, his orange coat perhaps a bit less vibrant, but his spirit unchanged. He maintained his evening appointments with the guardian with religious devotion, and their grooming sessions became even more tender and prolonged. It was as if they both understood that time was precious and not to be wasted. The Guardian's consistency through all seasons was remarkable. Whether the forest was buried in snow or lush with summer growth, he was there. His presence became as reliable as the sunrise, as natural as the changing leaves. I grew to depend on that steadiness, that sense of being watched over by something ancient and something wise. The changes in my cat Julian came so gradually that at first I told myself I was imagining things. His jumps to the windowsill required more effort. His magnificent coat lost some of his shine, and his appetite began to wane. When I finally took him to Dr. Martinez, her expression grew increasingly concerned. "He isn't strong," she said gently. "We need to start talking about his quality of life." Over the following weeks, as Julian's condition declined despite medications and dietary changes, Dr. Martinez's suggestions became more direct. She spoke of peaceful transitions, of preventing pain, of the responsibility we have to our beloved companions when their bodies begin to fail them. "He's been such a special cat," she would say. "You can give him a peaceful goodbye surrounded by love." The weight of the decision pressed down on me during the long nights when Julian would rest fitfully. Finally, after another difficult night when Julian barely touched his food, I made the appointment. My hands trembled as I scheduled what Dr. Martinez gently referred to as Julian's final visit. That evening, I sat with Julian in his favorite spot, gently stroking his fur. He purred softly, then turned his gaze toward the window and the darkening woods beyond. In the distance, I caught a glimpse of a familiar massive silhouette standing watch over us. I woke on that Thursday morning with dread so heavy that it felt like a physical weight. The appointment was at 10 o'clock, but when I went to Julian's favorite sleeping spot by the window, he wasn't there. I called his name softly, then I searched all his usual places: the sunny spot by the south window, the cozy corner behind the armchair, the warm space near the heating vent, but nothing. My search became more frantic as minutes ticked by. I looked in every room, every closet, every space large enough to hide a cat. Finally, I stepped outside, hoping to find him on the porch or in the garden. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and earth from the forest. I walked around the house, calling his name, but the forest felt different. Not empty, but holding its breath, as if keeping a secret too important to share. I stood at the edge of the trees, looking into the green depths where Julian had first appeared years ago. The usual morning chorus of birds was absent, replaced by a profound quiet that felt almost ceremonial. I called Julian's name one last time, my voice carrying across the stillness. As I turned to go back inside, I caught a glimpse of something moving deep in the forest. For just a moment, I thought I saw a familiar massive silhouette, and beside it, I thought I saw a flash of orange and white, but they were only there for one instant before the trees swallowed them again, and I wasn't certain that I had seen it. But Julian had made his choice. He had chosen to leave with his guardian, to return to the forest where he had come from, to find his own path, to whatever comes next. When Dr. Martinez's office eventually called to ask if I was coming in, I found myself able to speak with surprising calmness. "No, Julian's gone," I said simply. "He left on his own terms." In the days that followed, I found myself thinking about dignity and choices, about the difference between medical necessity and natural wisdom. Julian had lived his life on his own terms. From the moment he first stepped out of the forest, why shouldn't he also choose his farewell? I thought about the guardian Dogman and the depths of loyalty that had kept him watching over Julian all these years. In those final moments, when Julian needed something I couldn't provide, his ancient friend had been there to offer an alternative. Not the sterile efficiency of a veterinary clinic, but the timeless comfort of returning to the wild places where life follows older and deeper rhythms. There was much sadness, of course. I grieved for Julian's absence, for the mornings without his gentle presence by the window. But woven through that sadness was also gratitude for having been part of something so extraordinary and peace in knowing that Julian's story had ended the way he wanted it to. I never saw either one of them again. The forest returned to its natural rhythms, and the guardian dogman's protective presence faded like morning mist. But I carry with me the memory of an impossible friendship, of a cat who chose his own path through life and beyond, and of a mythical being who understood that sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to let go. Julian had taught me that there are many ways to say goodbye, and that the most meaningful ones often happen not in the places we expect, but in the quiet spaces where wild things make their own decisions about how their stories should end. The house does feel different now, but it doesn't feel empty, because it holds the echoes of purrs and the memory of amber eyes watching me from the forest.
He'll always fly and never crash. That's our EP today, named Evil Ash. Please join me in thanking tonight's executive producer, Jesse Evil Ash, for making this episode possible. As a channel member through YouTube, Jesse got to see this week's all-new secret uncensored members only Dogman story.
The familiar Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I saw him again last night. The Dogman or werewolf type creature stood upright on its hind legs like a man at the edge of my property line, where the manicured grass gives way to the wild tangle of oak and pine that stretches back into the state forest. I had never seen anything like him before, and yet, strangely, he seemed incredibly familiar to me, as though I should have known exactly who that was. Moonlight caught the silver-gray fur along his massive shoulders, and I could see the rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. He must have been 7 or 8 feet tall, with the powerful haunches of a wolf, but the upright posture of a man. His head turned toward my bedroom window, and for a moment, I swear our eyes met through the glass. I didn't move from my position by the curtain. Experience has taught me that sudden movements send him melting back into the shadows, and I've grown hungry for these little glimpses. His face is lupine like a wolf, but somehow more expressive than any wolf's. Intelligence burns behind those amber eyes, and sometimes I feel like I'm catching what almost looks like recognition there, as though he knew me. He lifted his muzzle into the air, tested the wind, and I pressed closer to the window. The rational part of my mind cataloged the impossibility of what I was seeing. The other part, the part that's been growing stronger these past months, whispered a name I'm afraid to say out loud. After several minutes, he turned and loped into the trees, disappearing so completely it might have been a dream. But the impressions of his massive paws in the soft earth by the fence line are still there this morning, deeper than any dog's prints, with claw marks that gouge the soil. This is the 4th time I've seen him since Boris the spider came back. The timing can't be coincidence. Back before the Dogman, there was Boris. He insisted everyone call him Boris the Spider, a nickname he'd earned from the tarantula tattooed across the back of his right hand. The spider's body sat in the center of his knuckles, its legs stretching down his fingers like he could make it crawl with a simple gesture. I met Boris at a bar on the wrong side of town, back when I thought dangerous men were exciting, instead of, well, actually dangerous. He was all leather jacket and motorcycle boots, with pale eyes that seemed to see right through you. The spider tattoo should have been warning enough, but I was 20 and stupid, and when he asked me to move in with him after only 3 weeks, I said okay. The house was his grandmother's old place, a small ranch with yellowing siding and a chain-link fence that he'd inherited when she died. It sat on 2 acres at the end of a dead-end road, with woods present close on 3 sides. Privacy, he called it, but I learned soon enough that isolation was a more accurate word. Boris worked construction, when he felt like it, which wasn't often. Mostly he drank beer and worked on motorcycles he never finished fixing. He had opinions about everything, my clothes, my friends, my job at the diner, and he wasn't shy about sharing them. At first I told myself he was just passionate, maybe protective. When he started following me to work, I actually called it romantic. The spider on his hand wasn't his only tattoo. Prison ink covered his arms, crude skulls and barbed wire. He'd done 3 years for assault when he was younger, something he mentioned casually, like it was a badge of honor. I stayed there for 2 years. 2 years of walking on eggshells, of making excuses for bruises, of telling myself things would get better. The house felt like a trap, and Boris like the spider waiting in the center of its web. By the end, I was barely leaving except for work, and even then, he'd timed my trips to the minute. The day everything changed started like any other. I was coming out of the Kroger with a bag of groceries, fishing for my keys in the bottom of my purse, when Boris appeared beside my car. I hadn't seen him in the parking lot, but that wasn't unusual. He was good at watching without being seen. "You were supposed to be home an hour ago," he said, and I could smell the beer on his breath even though it was barely 2 in the afternoon. I had to wait in line, I lied. Although I had actually stopped at the pharmacy to pick up birth control pills without telling him. See, Boris didn't believe in birth control. He said that wasn't natural, but I'd secretly been taking the pills for months. He grabbed my wrist, his fingers finding the same tender spots he always did. "Don't lie to me, Sarah. I drove by here 40 minutes ago and your car was already in the lot." The spider tattoo was inches from my face, and I found myself staring at it instead of meeting his eyes. "I ran into someone from work," I lied. "We talked." "Yeah? Who?" "Just Linda from the morning shift." His grip tightened. "Linda's the one married to that mechanic, right? The one with the shop on 4th Street? I nodded, confused by the question. "Funny thing," Boris said, leaning closer. "I just saw Linda at the gas station across the street. She's been there the whole time, cleaning windshields." My stomach dropped. I'd been caught in a lie, and we both knew what that meant. Boris's pale eyes went flat and cold, the way they always did before things got bad. "Please," I whispered, "not here." But he was already pulling me toward his truck, his fingers digging into my arm hard enough to leave marks. People were walking past us in the parking lot, but no one looked twice. Just another couple having a disagreement. And that is when I heard the voice. "Hey!" Deep, calm, with an inch of authority that made Boris stop mid-step. "Let go of her." We both turned. The man standing behind us was tall, maybe 6'4", with dark hair and the kind of build that suggested he worked with his hands. He wore jeans and a gray t-shirt, nothing special, but there was something about the way he held himself that made the parking lot feel a lot smaller. "You mind your own business," Boris said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. The stranger's dark eyes never left Boris's face. "I am minding my business, and I told you to let go of her." "This is my girlfriend," Boris said, tightening his grip on my arm. "We're having a private conversation." "No," the man said simply. "You're not." What happened next was almost too fast to follow. Boris let go of me and took a swing at the stranger, but the tall man caught his wrist mid-punch and twisted, sending Boris to his knees on the asphalt. The movement was fluid and practiced, like he'd done it 100 times before. "Walk away, genius," the stranger told Boris. "Don't come back." Boris scrambled to his feet, his face flushed with embarrassment and rage. He looked at me, then at the stranger, and for a moment I thought he might try again. But instead he spat on the ground and stalked back to his truck. "Are you okay?" the stranger asked, turning to me. I nodded, rubbing my arm where Boris had grabbed me. "Thank you." He told me his name was Paul, and when he smiled, something loosened in my chest that I hadn't realized was tight. "You want to get some coffee?" he asked. "I think your boyfriend's going to sit in that truck for a while waiting to see what you do." I looked over at Boris's truck. I saw him gripping the steering wheel and staring at us through the windshield. Paul was right. He'd follow me wherever I went, and whenever we got there, he'd make me pay for embarrassing him in public. "Yeah," I said, surprising myself, I would like some coffee." Paul waited while I put my groceries in my car, then walked me to a diner on the other side of the parking lot. I didn't look back, but I could feel Boris watching us as we left. Paul didn't even really ask me to move in. We just started moving my stuff over that night. I should have been nervous about moving so fast, but Paul felt like safety in a way that I'd almost forgotten existed. He was gentle with me, careful not to touch my arm where Boris had grabbed me until the bruises faded. He listened when I talked. He didn't interrupt with his own opinions about how I should think or feel. When I woke up screaming from nightmares about the spider tattoo, he held me until the shaking stopped. Paul worked as a contractor, specializing in custom carpentry. His hands were always slightly rough from sawdust and honest work, so different from Boris's soft fingers that only knew how to take and to hurt. Paul would leave early in the morning and come home tired but content, sometimes bringing me small gifts. A piece of interesting wood grain, a flower he'd found growing wild at a job site. Once, a smooth river stone that fit perfectly in my palm. His house felt like home. Paul reinforced the locks on the doors and installed motion sensor lights all around the perimeter. He never said it was because of Boris, but we both knew. He taught me how to use the baseball bat he kept beside the bed, though his presence alone seemed to be deterrent enough. I saw Boris drive by a few times in those first few weeks, slowing down as he passed, but he never did stop. "He's afraid of you," I told Paul one evening as we watched another slow pass from the living room window. Paul's jaw tightened. He should be afraid of me. There was something in his voice that made me look at him more carefully. In the dim light, his features seemed sharper somehow, more angular. When he turned to meet my gaze, his eyes caught the lamplight and reflected it back, like an animal's would. "Paul?" He blinked and the moment passed. "Sorry, I was just thinking about work tomorrow." But I'd seen something in that brief flash, something wild and protective, and not entirely human. I told myself it was just a strange light, just my imagination still jumpy from months of living with Boris's threats. Paul was gentle, civilized, everything that Boris wasn't. The idea that he might be hiding something dangerous seemed impossible. Except sometimes, late at night, I'd wake to find his side of the bed empty and the back door slightly ajar. In the morning, I'd find mud on the kitchen floor and I'd wonder where he'd gone in the darkness. If I would ask him, he would just smile and say he stepped out for air and he couldn't sleep. His explanations were always reasonable sounding, but something in his eyes suggested deeper truths that he wasn't ready to share. Everyone called her Morgana, although Paul said that wasn't her real name. She ran a shop downtown called Moonrise Curiosities. It sold crystals and tarot cards and herbs with names I couldn't pronounce. She was attractive, but in a way that made me feel plain. All flowing dark hair and knowing eyes, with silver rings on every finger, and a laugh that sounded like wind chimes. I first saw her at the farmer's market, buying bundles of sage and something the vendor called Devil's Claw. She moved through the crowd like she owned the space, and people stepped aside without seeming to realize they were doing it. When she smiled at Paul across the vegetable stand, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October morning. "Who's that?" I asked, but Paul was already walking toward her. I watched them talk. I saw the way he leaned in close to hear her over the market noise. She touched his arm when she laughed, and something twisted in my stomach. When Paul returned to my side, he was distracted and distant in a way I'd just never seen before. "She's someone I know," he said, but his eyes kept drifting back to where she stood. After that, Paul started staying out later. He'd come home from work and shower, then disappear for hours with vague explanations about meeting friends or running errands. I'd smell unfamiliar perfume on his clothes, something earthy and wild, like burning leaves and night-blooming flowers. I drove by Moonrise Curiosities one evening, and I saw his truck parked outside. Through the window, I could see them sitting together at a small table, her hands covering his, as she spoke intently. Candles flickered between them, and shadows danced on the walls in patterns that seemed too purposeful to be random. When I confronted him about this later, Paul did not deny it. "Morgana's teaching me things," he said, which was somehow worse than if he'd lied. "What kinds of things?" I asked. "Things about myself. Things about what I am." The way he said it made my skin crawl. "What are you?" "Paul, you're scaring me." He reached for me then, and I saw something wild flicker behind his eyes again. I would never hurt you. You have to believe that. But there are parts of me which I've kept hidden, because I didn't want to frighten you. What parts? I asked. But he was already pulling away, grabbing his keys from the counter. I need to go. We'll talk about this tomorrow. That was the last time I ever saw him. His truck was gone in the morning. His clothes were missing from the dresser. He left no note, no explanation, just an empty space where he had once been. I called his phone until the voicemail box was full. I drove to every job site where he'd worked. I even went to Moonrise Curiosities, but the shop was empty. A for lease sign already in the window. The woman at the real estate office said Morgana had paid her lease through the end of the month, then disappeared overnight. No forwarding address, no contact information, beyond a phone number that led to a dead line. Paul had vanished as completely as if he had never existed, leaving me alone in his house that no longer felt safe without him. 3 weeks later, Boris returned. 3 weeks of me jumping at every sound, checking the locks twice before bed, sleeping with the baseball bat Paul had given me. 3 weeks of watching for his truck, of taking different routes to and from work, of wondering if Paul's disappearance had somehow signaled that I was unprotected again. Boris chose a Thursday night, when rain was drumming against the windows and the power had flickered twice. I was in the kitchen making tea when I heard the knock. 3 sharp raps that made my blood freeze because I recognized the rhythm. Boris had always knocked like that, like he was entitled to an answer. I didn't go to the door, but I heard his voice anyway. I know you're in there. I saw your car in the driveway. I reached for my phone to call 911, but my hands were shaking so badly I could hardly hold it. Through the kitchen window, I could see his shadow moving around the perimeter of the house, testing windows, looking for an opening. Where's your fancy boyfriend? Boris called out, his voice closer now, maybe by the back door. Haven't seen his truck around lately. Did he finally get tired of you? The door handle rattled, and I realized with cold horror, Paul had never given me a key to the new deadbolt he'd installed. It was still locked, but Boris was persistent, and I could hear him working at something, maybe trying to jimmy the lock or force the frame. Can't hide from me forever, he said. I know you're scared, and I know you're alone. I crept toward the front of the house, thinking maybe I could slip out and run to my car, but through the living room window I saw Boris's truck parked sideways across the driveway, blocking my escape. He had planned this. He had been watching and waiting for the right moment. The back door creaked, and I knew he was inside with me. Come on, baby. I just want to talk with you. I could hear him moving through the house, his boots heavy on the hardwood floor. I pressed myself against the wall beside the kitchen doorway, gripping the baseball bat with both hands. My heart was pounding so hard, I almost felt he could hear it. I missed you, honey, he said, and I could tell he was in the living room now, getting closer. Things could go back to the way they were. We were good together, remember? That's when I heard it. A sound like nothing I'd ever heard before. A roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. Deep and primal and full of rage. It rattled the windows and it seemed to vibrate in my bones. Boris stopped talking. Through the kitchen window, I saw a shape moving in the backyard. Massive, upright, covered in dark fur. The motion sensor lights flickered on, and I got my first clear look at the Dogman. He was even larger than I'd imagined, his shoulders broader than any human's, his face a terrifying blend of wolf and man. His lips were pulled back in a snarl that revealed teeth like ivory daggers. Jesus H. Christmas, Boris whispered. I heard him stumble backward. The Dogman's head turned toward the house, and those amber eyes found me through the window. For a moment, we stared at each other through the glass, predator and prey, and I should have been terrified. But instead, I felt something I couldn't name. Recognition, maybe. Then he threw back his head and he howled, a sound that made every dog in the neighborhood start barking. It was a challenge, a warning, a promise of violence that made my primitive brain scream at me to run. Boris didn't need the warning twice. I heard him crash through the front door. I heard his boots pounding across the porch. His truck engine roared to life, and he peeled out of the driveway so fast his tires left rubber on the asphalt. When I looked back through the window, that Dogman was now gone. That was almost half a year ago, and I haven't seen Boris one time since. But I have seen the Dogman. He comes when the moon is full, and sometimes when it isn't. Always at night. Always watching from the tree line. I've stopped being afraid of him, because I've begun to understand something that my rational mind rejects, but my heart knows to be true. He's protecting me. I've started leaving food out. Raw meat from the butcher shop. Sometimes just scraps from my own dinner. In the morning it's always gone, and sometimes there are those massive paw prints in the soft earth nearby. I tell myself I'm feeding a stray dog, but I know better. The resemblance grows stronger each time I see him. The way he holds his head, the intelligence in his eyes, the careful way he moves despite his size. Sometimes I catch him watching me through the window, and there's something so human in his expression, it just takes my breath away. I've done research, read every book I can find about werewolves and shapeshifters and ancient curses. Most of it is nonsense. Some of the older texts mention women who practice the old ways. Women who could change a man's very nature if they knew the right words and the right rituals. Like Morgana. He had said she was teaching him about what he was. The timing haunts me. Paul disappears when a woman rumored to practice black magic shows up in his life. Then suddenly there's a creature in the woods who protects me the way Paul used to. A creature whose eyes hold the same gentle intelligence that I used to see in Paul's face. I know how crazy it sounds. I know that grief and fear can make you see connections that aren't there, make you believe impossible things because the truth is too painful to accept. But late at night, when I see that familiar silhouette moving through the trees, I whisper Paul's name into the darkness. Sometimes I swear the Dogman pauses when he hears it, his great head turning toward my voice, like he's trying to remember something he's forgotten. And in those moments, I let myself believe that somewhere inside that powerful, dangerous form, Paul is still protecting me, the only way he can. The moon is full tonight, and I'm waiting by the window again. I'm waiting to see if the man I loved has become the monster who guards me, and I'm wondering if I'll ever be brave enough to find out for sure. He's a guy who's got it going on. I'm talking about today's EP named John. Everybody please say thank you to John Carnagon, who made this episode possible by donating to us by using YouTube's thanks button. Here to find out the ways you can help this channel stay online is our international TV spokesmongrel, Henry Lee Dogman. Hank!
Thanks, Biggie. And thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that when it cuts off after I think 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.